The bells tolled slowly, each strike echoing across the square like the countdown of a funeral drum. The town of Valladolid lay hushed beneath the black sky, its narrow streets emptied as the people pressed toward the plaza, drawn not by choice but by compulsion. It was the year of our Lord 1481, only 3 years after Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had secured papal permission to establish a tribunal of faith. But already its presence was unmistakable, its shadow long. Tonight, its power would blaze for all to see. The square was alive with torchlight. Dozens of flames hissed and snapped in the wind, their smoke curling into the heavens as though to choke the stars themselves. The walls of the cathedral loomed above, its spires piercing the night sky, its stones glowing orange in the restless light. The townspeople huddled together, their faces lit in uneven flickers, eyes wide, voices hushed. Mothers held children close, whispering prayers into their hair. Fathers muttered grimly, their jaws set, their eyes never leaving the towering wooden structures at the square's centre. The stakes! They rose like skeletal trees, their trunks thick beams of timber driven into the cobblestones, surrounded by carefully stacked bundles of wood. Straw lay beneath, dry and brittle, eager for flame. The executioners had prepared everything with precision, not too little wood, lest the condemned suffer longer than the priests allowed, and not too much, lest the fire spread to innocent homes. This was no ordinary execution. This was a sacred theatre. Every detail was part of the ritual. From the darkness beyond the square came the sound of marching feet. The crowd shifted, a ripple of anticipation and dread running through it. Soldiers appeared first, their armour gleaming, halberds in hand, forming a corridor of steel through which the condemned were led. Behind them shuffled men and women, their wrists bound, their ankles dragging. They wore yellow robes, San Benito, painted with grotesque images of demons, flames and devils. On their heads were paper caps, corozas, marked with the same symbols of damnation. The condemned walked slowly, some stumbling, some carried, others upright and strangely calm. One woman clutched a crucifix to her breast, muttering prayers through cracked lips. A young man's eyes darted wildly, searching the crowd for a familiar face, though none dared meet his gaze. Another prisoner, an elderly scholar, his beard singed and matted from weeks in the dungeon, whispered words in Hebrew, too faint to be heard clearly, but enough for the guards to shove him forward with renewed force. Behind the prisoners strode the Inquisitors. Their black Dominican robes trailed across the stones, their hoods shadowing stern, unsmiling faces. In their hands they carried the tools of authority, scrolls bearing the papal bull of 1478, holy books marked with ribbons, and a crucifix raised high above their heads. One stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd as he unrolled the parchment. By the grace of God and the authority of Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and Isabella, Queen of Castile, defenders of the Holy Faith, we, the Inquisitors of the Holy Office, declare these souls guilty of heresy. The charges were read one by one, each name accompanied by the litany of alleged sins. Pedro Diaz, accused of Judaizing, of observing the Sabbath in secret, of refusing the holy sacraments, of denying the divinity of Christ. Maria Gonzalez, accused of sorcery, of invoking spirits, of cursing neighbours, of keeping amulets against the will of God. Diego de Herrera, accused of blasphemy, of mocking Holy Church, of teaching false doctrine, of leading others astray. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some spat at the condemned. Others looked away, uncomfortable. All knew the rules. To question the verdict was to risk suspicion oneself. In a land where informants lurked in every tavern, every marketplace, every confessional, silence was survival. A hush fell as a priest ascended a platform near the stakes. He raised the crucifix high, the silver gleaming in the firelight, and his voice rang out, "Repent, children of God! Repent that your souls may yet be saved, though your bodies be consumed. God is merciful, and the fire is his cleansing flame." Some of the condemned fell to their knees, weeping, begging forgiveness. Their voices cracked, their words tumbling over one another in frantic prayer. Others stood stiff, silent, eyes fixed on the heavens. The scholar muttered still in his forbidden tongue. The executioners moved forward. Rough hands seized the prisoners, tying them to the stakes with ropes and chains. The wood at their feet rustled dryly as straw shifted beneath their weight. The smell of pitch filled the air as torches were dipped into tar. The Inquisitor spoke once more. "Let it be known that the Holy Office does not condemn the soul, but the sin. These flames do not punish, they purify. Through the fire heresy shall be burned away, and the spirit restored to God." It was a formula, repeated in every city, everywhere. Across Spain for centuries. It framed the horror as mercy, the cruelty as love, and the crowd, fearful, faithful, desperate to believe, whispered their assent. The torches were lowered. Flames leapt eagerly to the straw, racing upward, consuming wood and cloth in moments. The prisoners screamed, their voices piercing the night. Some thrashed against their bonds, their bodies arching in agony as fire licked at skin. Others cried out to God, their voices ragged prayers of despair. The woman with the crucifix held it aloft until her hand was lost in flame. The crowd watched, transfixed. Some wept, others prayed, others stared in silence. For them, this was a lesson as much as spectacle. This was what awaited those who strayed from the true faith, those who clung to forbidden customs, those who dared whisper doubts about the church or the crown. The fire was more than execution, it was terror sanctified. And the Inquisition ensured it was never forgotten. Not all executions were so fiery. Many prisoners, broken in body and spirit by weeks of torture, confessed and were sentenced to prison, penance, or exile. Some wore their sanbenitos for the rest of their lives, walking reminders of sin, living warnings to their neighbours. But for those deemed unrepentant or too symbolic to spare, fire was inevitable. The stake was the Inquisition's theatre, the auto-da-fe its stage, and the entire kingdom its audience. When the flames finally died, only blackened corpses remained, their chains glowing red in the embers. Executioners raked through the ashes, ensuring nothing survived. The smell of burned flesh clung to the air, to the stones, to the people who dispersed in silence. The crowd returned to their homes, carrying the memory with them, whispering to their children, repeating the lesson: obey, believe, conform. The Inquisitors withdrew to their chambers, their black robes unmarked by ash. For them, the night was not horror but triumph, proof that the will of God and the authority of the crown had been enacted in unison. For Ferdinand and Isabella, each nights were foundations of empire, each flame a stone laid in the edifice of Catholic Spain. But history would remember differently. To chroniclers and satirists, to enemies abroad, these fires were not purifying but damning. They were the birth of terror, the mark of fanaticism, the symbol of an age when faith became cruelty. For the people who lived through it, however, there was no such distance. There was only the smell of smoke in their hair, the vision of flames in their dreams, and the fear that next time the name called might be their own. The tower of the Inquisition had been raised. Its doors were open, and once open, they would not close for more than 3 centuries. This was Spain in 1478, a kingdom united under one faith, one monarch, one terror. And its story begins not with parchment or papal bulls, but with fire in the night. Before the fire, before the chains and the whispers in the dungeon, Spain was a land already soaked in blood and shadow. For centuries its soil had been the battlefield of faiths. The Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Granada, each fractured further by the lines of faith and blood. Christians, Muslims and Jews lived side by side, sometimes in uneasy tolerance, sometimes in open war. The Reconquista had stretched across nearly 800 years, a long, grinding struggle in which Christian kingdoms pushed southward against Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus. Town by town, citadel by citadel, crosses replaced crescents on the skyline. By the mid-15th century, the Muslim stronghold of Granada remained the last jewel of Islamic Spain, glittering still with palaces and minarets but hemmed in by armies and treaties. Christian Spain, however, was not a monolith. Castile and Aragon were kingdoms with their own laws, their own languages, their own jealousies. Rival dynasties had clashed for centuries, their alliances shifting like tides. Only in 1469 did marriage begin to weave them together, when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile bound their crowns and their ambitions in a union that would reshape not only Spain but the world. Isabella was pious, intelligent and iron-willed. Ferdinand was pragmatic, cunning and no less devout. Together they saw a vision: one Spain, one faith, one crown. They would not simply rule kingdoms, they would forge an empire, and at its foundation would be Catholic orthodoxy, unchallenged and absolute. Yet in their path stood diversity. For centuries, Jews had been part of Spain's fabric. They were physicians, scholars, merchants, tax collectors. Many thrived under Muslim rule in earlier centuries, serving as translators between Arabic and Latin, preserving ancient knowledge. Even under Christian kings, Jews often found protection, though always fragile, always conditional. Pogroms erupted periodically. In 1391, mobs swept through Seville, Toledo and Barcelona, slaughtering thousands of Jews and forcing survivors to baptism. The converts who emerged from these massacres, known as conversos or new Christians, became both part of Christian society and permanent outsiders within it. To their neighbours, the conversos were objects of suspicion. Were they true Christians or Jews in secret? Did they eat pork as law required? Did they cross themselves sincerely? Did they whisper Hebrew prayers at night? Envy of their success mingled with fear of their difference, creating fertile ground for slander. By the 15th century, riots against conversos were as much about economics as faith. Debt wiped out in blood, competition erased with fire. Muslims too lived within Christian lands. In conquered territories many remained, farming, trading, paying special taxes for the right to keep their faith. These mudajars were tolerated so long as they remained humble and useful, but tolerance frayed in times of war. In the Christian imagination, Muslims were enemies not only abroad but within, spies and traitors whose loyalties belonged to Granada or the Ottoman Sultan rather than to Spain. Thus, by 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella inherited a kingdom united in name but fractured in soul. To truly bind it, they believed, faith must be uniform. Heresy was not merely a religious crime but a political threat, an acid that could dissolve unity, leaving only rebellion and ruin. The idea of Inquisition was not new. The medieval church had long pursued heretics. Cathars in Languedoc, Waldensians in the Alps, free thinkers scattered across Europe. Papal inquisitors had roamed from city to city, questioning, condemning, burning. But these were papal instruments wielded from Rome. What Ferdinand and Isabella sought was different. They petitioned Pope Sixtus IV for the right to establish their own inquisition, one not merely of church but of crown. The Pope hesitated. To grant kings control over inquisitors was dangerous, for it gave monarchs power over the souls of their subjects. But Ferdinand and Isabella argued with persistence. Spain was fragile, they said. Heresy threatened its unity. Only by rooting out false Christians could they build a nation worthy of God's blessing. Reluctantly, in November of 1478, Sixtus issued the bull Exigit Sinceris Devotionis Effectus, authorizing the monarchs to appoint inquisitors. It was a turning point. From that parchment sprang an institution unlike any before it, a tribunal of faith bound not to Rome but to the Spanish crown. It would become a machine of fear, its gears turning on denunciations, confessions, and fire. But in 1478 it was not yet the monster it would become. At first, it was a shadow, a rumour. In Seville, the first tribunal opened in 1480, its dungeon filling quickly with conversos accused of backsliding into Judaism. Trials were secret, accusations anonymous, confessions wrung from prisoners who never saw their accusers. The people of Seville watched in dread as their neighbours vanished into the fortress and emerged only in Sanbenitos, paraded through the streets in shame before fire consumed them. The spectacle spread. By 1481, more than 200 had been executed in Seville alone. Ashes stained the squares. Smoke curled above the city like incense of terror. The message was clear: Spain would have one faith or it would have none. And yet, whispers spread just as quickly. Did the inquisitors truly care for souls or for crowns and coffers? Each heretic condemned meant property confiscated, wealth flowing into royal and ecclesiastical treasuries. Families were ruined, their estates absorbed by the very institution that condemned them. Was it zeal or greed that drove the flames higher? Even in these earliest years, the lines blurred between religion and politics, between salvation and power. For Isabella, faith was genuine, her piety unquestionable. For Ferdinand, faith served as instrument. Together they wove it into the sinew of empire. The Inquisition was born not only from belief but from necessity, not only from fear of God but from fear of rebellion. The Spain before the Inquisition was a land of crossroads. Moorish palaces still glittered in Granada, Jewish scholars still debated scripture in Toledo, Christian kings still quarrelled over borders. But in the hearts of Ferdinand and Isabella, such diversity was weakness. To them, unity could only mean uniformity, and uniformity could only be achieved through fear. Thus the stage was set. The pyres of Valladolid and Seville were not accidents of cruelty but deliberate signals. Spain had entered a new age, one in which the smell of incense and the stench of burning flesh would mingle, one in which faith was policed by fire, one in which whispers could damn and silence could save. The people of Spain learned quickly, watch your words, watch your neighbours, watch yourself. For the Inquisition had been born, and with it came the promise that no corner of Spain, no hearth, no prayer whispered in the dark would escape its gaze. It began not with fire, but with parchment. In November of 1478, Pope Sixtus IV dipped his quill into ink and wrote words that would outlive him by centuries. His bull, Exigit Sinceris Devotionis Affectus, granted Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile the unprecedented right to appoint inquisitors within their realms. For centuries before, the Church had kept such powers close, dispatching papal inquisitors from Rome to hunt heresy in far-flung provinces. Now, for the first time, inquisitorial power passed into the hands of monarchs. With a flourish of pen and seal, Spain's rulers were given license to police the souls of their own subjects. The justification was holy. The papal bull spoke of the monarch's sincere devotion, of their desire to protect Christendom from heresy. Yet in practice it was political genius. Ferdinand and Isabella had bound faith to their crown in a way no king or queen before them had dared. Heresy was no longer simply sin against God, it was treason against Spain. To doubt the Trinity, to light a Sabbath lamp, to whisper Hebrew prayers, all became acts not only of spiritual error, but of rebellion against monarch and nation. And so the Inquisition was born. At first it was small, almost invisible. Ferdinand and Isabella appointed 2 Dominican friars to serve as the first inquisitors. They began their work in Seville, where the converso population was large and tensions already ran high. Rumours spread quickly, neighbours arrested without warning, entire families dragged away in the night, trials conducted behind closed doors. The accused were denied the names of their accusers, evidence was secret, judges and executioners were the same. In 1480, the Tribunal of Seville was officially established. Within a year, the prisons overflowed. Conversos were its first quarry, those Jews who, after pogroms and massacres, had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing Judaism in secret. It mattered little whether the suspicion was true. A neighbour's envy, a rival's grudge, even a careless word muttered in anger could bring the knock on the door. The trial process was shrouded in dread. Once arrested, the accused were held in secret cells. Days, weeks, even months could pass without hearing the charges. Fear gnawed at mum in silence. Did their neighbour denounce them? Their servant? Their child? When the charges finally came, they were vague general. Judaizing, mocking the sacraments, sorcery. The accused could name enemies whose testimony might be dismissed, but only a handful, and often not the right ones. And so suspicion grew like mould in darkness, impossible to erect. Confession was the goal, not truth. Priests and inquisitors pressed the accused to repent, to admit their errors, to name others. Those who denied guilt were tortured. Those who confessed were often still punished, but their lives might be spared. The calculus was cruelly simple. The more names you gave, the greater your chance of survival. Thus the Inquisition devoured communities from within, turning brother against brother, wife against husband, child against parent. By 1481, Seville burned. That year alone, contemporary accounts record more than 200 executions. The condemned were paraded in San Benito's before crowds, their crimes read aloud, their bodies tied to stakes. The flames rose, and with them rose fear. A city that once thrummed with diversity, Jews, Christians, Muslims, all trading and living within its walls, became a place of suspicion. To be different was to be damned. To be accused was to be guilty. The papacy itself grew uneasy. Sixtus IV, though he had authorized the Inquisition, was alarmed by reports of its severity. In 1482 he wrote angrily to Ferdinand and Isabella, condemning the abuses of their inquisitors, the greed, the cruelty, the indiscriminate arrests. Many true and faithful Christians, he wrote, have been unjustly imprisoned, deprived of their goods, tortured and condemned. But his protests came too late. The machine had already been set in motion, and Ferdinand, pragmatic and relentless, would not yield. For the monarchs, the Inquisition was not a temporary measure, it was the foundation of their rule. The reasoning was twofold. On one level, the Inquisition was a weapon of conformity. Spain was being forged into a single kingdom, and unity demanded uniformity. There could be no fractures, no competing loyalties, no faiths whispering in the dark. On another level, the Inquisition was a weapon of power. Property seized from the condemned flowed into royal coffers. Nobles who resisted the crown could find themselves accused of heresy as easily as conversos. Inquisition and monarchy fed one another, each strengthening the other's grasp. The year 1483 marked a turning point. That year, the monarchs appointed Tomás de Torquemada as the first Grand Inquisitor. A Dominican friar of severe piety, Torquemada was a man of ascetic habits and uncompromising zeal. His vision of Spain was one of purity, its faith scoured clean of heresy, its people bound in obedience. Under his leadership, the Inquisition spread like wildfire. Tribunals were established in Córdoba, Toledo, Valencia, Barcelona. By the end of the decade, no corner of Spain was safe from its reach. The very sight of the Inquisitor became emblem of terror, a black-robed figure, stern-faced, eyes cold as iron. Behind him came scribes with parchments, guards with chains, priests with crucifixes. His arrival in a town was enough to silence taverns, to empty marketplaces, to drive families into frenzied acts of self-defense, burning books, slaughtering lambs in public to prove they ate pork, crossing themselves compulsively. The Inquisition was more than an institution. It was a presence, an atmosphere. It did not simply punish heresy. It made heresy unthinkable. It did not simply execute dissenters. It made dissent invisible. Fear did the work that fire began. And yet, even as fear spread, so too did myth. Across Europe, whispers exaggerated the horrors. Iron maidens, endless racks, rivers of blood. Much of it was propaganda, the black legend cultivated by Spain's rivals. Yet exaggeration was hardly necessary. The truth was dark enough. Men and women were tortured, broken, executed. Families were ruined, communities scattered. Fire consumed, and with it was consumed the fragile tolerance that had once defined Iberia. The birth of the Spanish Inquisition was not a sudden eruption, but a slow ignition. Parchment lit the flame, fear fed it, politics fanned it. By the end of the 15th century, it was no longer an experiment but a reality, woven into the fabric of Spain. To be Spanish was to be Catholic. To be anything else was to be condemned. And so the Inquisition, born in maple ink and royal ambition, grew into something more enduring than either pope or monarch had imagined. It would outlast Torquemada, outlast Ferdinand and Isabella, outlast the very age that birthed it. It was no longer the work of men alone. In the eyes of those who lived beneath it, it was a shadow cast by God himself, dark, inescapable, eternal. The Spanish Inquisition was not merely born from parchments and papal seals. Institutions do not move on their own. They require flesh, voice, and iron hands. In its earliest years, when it was still fragile and contested, it found its embodiment in one man, Tomás de Torquemada. To his enemies, his very name became a curse, a hiss of horror that echoed through Europe. To his allies, he was the hand of God made flesh, the stern guardian of Spain's soul. To history he remains both zealot and executioner, reformer and fanatic cloaked forever in black Dominican robes. Torquemada was born around 1420 in the small Castilian town of Valladolid, the grandson of conversos. Ironically, his blood carried the very taint he would later persecute so fiercely, but in his youth he pursued a path of purity. Joining the Dominican order, he embraced asceticism with fervour. He ate little, slept little, prayed long hours in the cold. His body was gaunt, his face sharp, his eyes deep-set and unyielding. Within cloister walls, he became known for his strictness, for his refusal to bend, for a piety that seemed as harsh as it was holy. By the 1470s, Torquemada had risen to prominence as confessor to Isabella of Castile. The queen, deeply devout and hungry for spiritual guidance, found in him not merely a priest but a prophet of sorts. His words carried the authority of conviction, unshaken, absolute. To Isabella, who dreamed of uniting Spain under God, Torquemada was a natural ally. He warned her constantly of heresy's dangers, of the lurking treachery of false Christians, of the wrath of God that would surely fall upon a kingdom tolerant of sin. His zeal became hers, her power became his. In 1483, Ferdinand and Isabella appointed him as the first Inquisitor General of Castile and Aragon. From that moment, the Inquisition ceased to be a local tribunal and became a national machinery. Torquemada held authority to appoint sub-inquisitors, to establish tribunals in new cities, to oversee procedure. He created a network, dungeons in Seville, Córdoba, Valencia, Zaragoza, each operating with the same grim precision. Under his hand, the Inquisition became less a tribunal than an empire of fear. What made Torquemada so effective was not merely his zeal, but his organisation. He drafted manuals outlining the procedure, how prisoners were to be questioned, how confessions recorded, how property seized. He insisted on secrecy, ensuring that the accused never knew their accusers, that trials were conducted in shadows. Fear thrived in that darkness. Rumours of spies multiplied. Every household imagined ears at the door, every whispered prayer a potential betrayal. Torquemada understood that terror worked best when invisible, and yet he was visible enough. His processions through towns were spectacles of dread. The black-robed Dominican walking at the head of guards and scribes, a crucifix raised high, a crowd falling into hushed silence at his approach. To see Torquemada was to feel the weight of inevitability, as though the very air thickened with judgment. His enemies abroad painted him as monster, the very face of cruelty. In Italy, pamphlets described him as bloodthirsty, delighting in the screams of the tortured. In France, poets named him the scourge of Spain. Centuries later, Voltaire and Montaigne would invoke his name as shorthand for fanaticism, and yet contemporaries who knew him personally painted a more complex picture. Some described a man of austere simplicity, sleeping on straw, fasting constantly, refusing gifts. He was not greedy, they said, not cruel for cruelty's sake. He believed, and in many ways that made him more terrifying. Under his tenure, the auto da fe became ritualized. The condemned, dressed in San Benitos, were paraded through the streets in long lines, their crimes painted upon their robes. The crowds gathered not only to watch punishment, but to witness theatre. A sermon, a confession, a burning. The execution itself was framed as sacrifice, the flames as altar. The Inquisition ceremonies fused liturgy and terror until they were indistinguishable. Between 1483 and 1498, the years of Torquemada's leadership, thousands were condemned. Contemporary chroniclers speak of 2,000 burned at the stake, though some estimates rise far higher. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned, fined, or forced into lifelong penance. Entire converso families were uprooted, their estates confiscated, their names blackened. Torquemada moved relentlessly, sweeping Spain of what he saw as corruption. His obsession with purity extended beyond tribunals. He was among the loudest voices urging Ferdinand and Isabella to expel Spain's Jews entirely. In 1492, as Granada fell and Muslim rule ended in Iberia, Torquemada pressed the monarchs to cleanse the land further. His sermon before the royal court was chilling. Do not let greed for wealth or fear of the Jews' power dissuade you. Remember the treachery of Judas, who for 30 pieces of silver betrayed his master. Expel these Judases from your kingdom, lest they betray Christ again. His words carried the weight of prophecy, and the monarchs obeyed. That year, the Edict of Expulsion was signed, forcing all Jews who refused baptism to leave Spain. Tens of thousands fled. Many more were forced into conversion, swelling the very ranks of conversos the Inquisition would continue to hunt. Whispers of dissent against Torquemada existed, even within Spain. Some nobles grumbled that the Inquisition enriched the crown at their expense. Some clerics murmured that cruelty disguised as piety could not be holy. Even Pope Sixtus IV, who had granted the Inquisition in the first place, expressed regret at its excesses, but none could oppose him openly. To question Torquemada was to question the crown, to question Isabella herself. His power was untouchable, and yet Torquemada was not immortal. In 1498, after 15 years as Grand Inquisitor, he died in the monastery of Avila. His body was buried quietly, but his name was already legend. To the faithful, he was a saintly guardian of purity, a man who had defended Spain against corruption. To the fearful, he was a spectre of cruelty, a symbol of the Inquisition's merciless reach. To history, he became myth, his name forever etched alongside racks, dungeons, and flames. But Torquemada was only the first. After him came others, Diego de Deza, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, inquisitors who continued and expanded his work. The machine he built outlived him, perfected by those who followed. Its secrecy, its procedures, its rituals of fire all remained, spreading beyond Spain into Portugal, into the New World, into centuries yet unborn. The first inquisitors set the pattern. They transformed suspicion into law, fear into ritual, cruelty into liturgy. They made heresy not a private sin but a public theatre, a performance staged in town squares with fire as curtain. They convinced monarchs and peasants alike that to kill the body was to save the soul, and they taught Spain and the world that the line between faith and fanaticism is as thin as the edge of a blade. As the flames rose in Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo, the people learned the lesson well. God's mercy could look like smoke in the night, and his justice could sound like the screams of the condemned. The Spanish Inquisition was not only fire in the public square, its true power lay in the silence before the flames, in the slow, inexorable process that dragged the accused from home to dungeon, from dungeon to confession, from confession to stake. It was a system of ritualized fear, designed not to discover truth but to compel obedience. Every Spaniard, from peasant to noble, knew the shape of this nightmare, even if only from rumour. It began with a whisper. A neighbour saw a man light 2 candles on a Friday night and muttered that he must be a Jew in secret. A servant overheard her mistress muttering prayers in an unfamiliar tongue and told a priest. A rival merchant denounced his competitor to rid himself of debt. A jealous spouse or a resentful apprentice, a child repeating overheard words, all could be informants, whether willing or coerced. The Inquisition encouraged it, cultivating suspicion until it became second nature. Denunciations were secret, and once made, they could not be undone. The accused was often unaware that a case had begun until the knock came at midnight. Soldiers, accompanied by a notary of the Inquisition, arrived at the door with an order for arrest. There was no trial yet, no defence, only the sudden collapse of life as it had been. Property was seized on the spot, houses, livestock, tools, books, placed under the seal of the Inquisition to prevent their misuse. Families were left destitute, regardless of outcome. The prisoner was taken to a secret cell. These cells were designed to break the spirit. Dark, airless, sometimes no larger than a coffin, with straw for bedding and chains for company. Silence reigned, broken only by the shuffle of guards' boots or the cries of other prisoners echoing down corridors. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, time dissolved. Prisoners rarely knew the charges, nor the names of their accusers. The uncertainty gnawed at them, hollowing hope. Eventually came the first interrogation. The accused was led into a chamber where inquisitors sat at a raised bench, black-robed, crucifix gleaming before them. Scribes waited with quills, ready to record every word. The inquisitor began with a ritual, an oath sworn on the Gospels to tell the truth. Refusal was impossible. "Do you know why you are here?" Most answered no. "You are accused of heresy. You will be given the opportunity to confess your errors, to return to the faith, to save your soul." Confession was the goal, always. The Inquisition was not interested in defence. Guilt was assumed. Denial merely prolonged the process. The prisoner was urged to confess all sins, even those not yet named. "Search your conscience," the Inquisitor pressed. "God sees your heart. Hide nothing." When confession did not come, the accused was presented with accusations, vague, general, often absurd. You observed the Sabbath. You refused pork. You spoke in Arabic. You denied the virgin birth. The names of accusers were never revealed, but the prisoner could offer a list of enemies whose testimony might be dismissed. How many enemies could one name? How many neighbours would dare to defend you? For some, the process ended here. Fear broke them. They confessed, begged forgiveness, named others. For others, silence held. For those, another chamber waited, the chamber of torment. Though torture was officially restricted, not to endanger life, not to spill blood, its use was sanctioned as a tool of salvation. The logic was perverse. Better to break the body than to lose the soul. In practice, the rules blurred quickly. The prisoner was stripped, bound, and presented with the instruments of pain. The Inquisitor did not touch the levers or ropes. Executioners did the work. but the Inquisitor's words guided every act. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. The strappado hoisted prisoners by the wrists until shoulders dislocated. Water torture filled lungs with choking streams until confession burst from lips. The screams echoed through the stone halls, mingling with prayers recited by priests as though to sanctify the agony. Under such torment, names poured out. Confessions were written down, signed if the prisoner could still hold a quill, or marked with a trembling cross. Later, when asked to repeat the confession freely, many did so. Fear of returning to the chamber of torment was enough. Confession did not mean release. At best, it meant penance, imprisonment, fines, wearing the sanbenito in public for life. At worst, it meant execution, but merciful by strangling before the fire. For those who refused to confess, who proclaimed innocence even to the end, fire consumed them alive. The trial itself was less trial than ritual. The accused stood before inquisitors while scribes read aloud the charges and the confession. Witnesses, often coerced or bribed, gave testimony. The prisoner's defence was minimal, bound by secrecy, limited by ignorance. Verdicts were foregone conclusions, and yet the Inquisition cloaked its judgments in ceremony. Sentences were pronounced not in private chambers, but in grand spectacles, the auto da fe, the act of faith. Prisoners were marched in procession, their robes marking guilt, their heads bowed. Crowds filled squares, watching as verdicts were read aloud. Some were condemned to exile, others to prison, others to the stake. The auto da fe was both justice and theatre, designed to terrify and instruct. To the crown, this machinery was a triumph. It kept subjects obedient, silenced dissent, filled coffers with the confiscated property. To the church, it was purification, at least on the surface. To the people, it was nightmare. Any whisper could damn them. Any neighbour could destroy them. Life became performance, crossing oneself loudly, eating pork publicly, attending mass conspicuously. Faith became less about belief than survival. What is most chilling is how ordinary it became. Families taught their children not to speak freely, not to mention household custom, not to repeat overheard words. Markets buzzed with gossip, but always cautiously. In confessionals, priests asked probing questions. Did you keep the Sabbath? Did you know others who did? Even the sacraments became nets of surveillance. The trial of faith was not a single event, but a way of life. It reshaped Spain into a theatre of obedience, where every act, every word, every penance was measured against suspicion. And behind it all stood the Inquisitor's shadow, silent, watchful, unyielding. By the end of the 15th century, thousands had passed through this machinery. Some were broken in the dungeon, some burned in the square, many scarred for life by penance. Whether guilty or innocent mattered little. The process itself was the punishment. The Inquisition was less about rooting out heresy than about ensuring that heresy was never visible again. Fear became the true confession. The dungeon is where the myth of the Inquisition fused with its reality. Stone walls sweating with damp, a single torch sputtering in its bracket, throwing grotesque shadows across the room. The stench of mildew, of rust, of sweat and blood seeped into the very stones. Prisoners whispered of this place in trembling voices, the chamber of torment, the room where the Inquisition saved souls by breaking bodies. Officially, torture was allowed only under strict conditions. The inquisitors swore they did not delight in cruelty. It was, they claimed, a tool of necessity, a last resort, used sparingly, permitted only to extract the truth when lesser means had failed. The rules said torture should not endanger life or limb, nor spill blood. It was not, they insisted, punishment, but purification, the pain of the body cleansing the error of the soul. But in practice, the boundaries blurred until mercy and cruelty were indistinguishable. The prisoner was led into the chamber, stripped to a thin shift, bound in chains. The inquisitors sat at a high bench, crucifix glinting in the torchlighter, their black robes making them look like shadows themselves. They did not touch the instruments, that task fell to the executioner, but their words directed every turn of rope, every splash of water, every wrench of limb. A scribe sat nearby, quill poised, ready to record not only the confession but the prisoner's cries, their pleas for mercy, their words of despair. Even pain was made into record, catalogued as proof of heresy. The instruments waited in silence, the rack, a long wooden frame with rollers at either end, ropes wound around wrists and ankles. As the executioner turned the wheel, the ropes tightened, stretching the body inch by inch. Joints strained, ligaments tore, bones cracked. The victim screamed. their body arched in impossible agony, tendons snapping like cords. Few withstood more than a few turns before confessing to whatever words the inquisitors demanded. The strappado, a rope tied to the prisoner's wrists, bound, behind the back. The rope was thrown over a pulley fixed high in the ceiling. With a signal, the executioner hoisted the victim into the air, their arms twisting unnaturally behind them, shoulders dislocated with an audible snap. Sometimes the prisoner was dropped suddenly, then jerked to a stop mid-fall, the shock tearing muscles, breaking bones. Again and again the body was wrenched until words burst from lips, true or false, it mattered not. The iron boot, wooden boards or iron frames clamped around the legs, wedges driven in with hammers, crushing flesh and shattering bone. Victims shrieked until they fainted, only to be revived with water and forced to endure more. The shattered legs often left them crippled, unable to walk even if they survived the trial. The toca, water torture. The prisoner was bound flat, their mouth forced open with a cloth. Water was poured relentlessly down the throat, choking, suffocating, filling lungs until the victim convulsed and clawed at the air. To watch was to see drowning enacted without end, the terror of death repeated again and again until the prisoner confessed. There were other instruments, less known but no less cruel. Iron collars tightened around necks until breath came in gasps. Thumbscrews crushed fingers into pulp. Spiked chairs held bodies in agonizing stillness. The imagination of pain was vast, and the Inquisition did not invent it, but it sanctified it, cloaked it in ritual, made it an extension of God's will. The inquisitors themselves often remained unmoved. Their role was not to scream, but to ask questions, to remind the prisoner that confession was the only path to mercy. They prayed aloud while the victim writhed. They told them their agony was temporary, that their soul's salvation depended on honesty. Tell the truth, they urged, as bones cracked. Confess, and God will forgive. And confessions came. They always came. Names of neighbours, of family, of friends, whispered through sobs, gasped through blood, screamed in delirium. Once spoken, these names became new cases, new arrests, new confessions. Torture did not merely extract words, it multiplied them, spreading suspicion like plague. There was a psychological cruelty to the process as well. Prisoners were often shown the instruments before they were used. The Inquisitor would walk them slowly past the rack, the strappado, the boots. These are the remedies of the Holy Office, he would say. We pray you speak truth before they are necessary. For some, the sight alone broke them. For others, it was the endless waiting, days and nights spent in their cells imagining the pain to come. In this way, terror did as much work as rope and fire. The secrecy of the trials deepened the dread. Outside the dungeon, families could only guess at what was happening. Rumours grew wild of spikes driven into skulls, of cages filled with rats, of furnaces where bodies roasted alive. Some of these tales were exaggerations spread by Spain's enemies in later centuries as part of the Black Legend, but enough was true. Enough was documented in inquisitorial records themselves that the myth fused seamlessly with reality. For those who survived, the marks were permanent. Crippled limbs, shattered teeth, blindness from prolonged hanging. And beyond the body, the soul carried scars. Many left the dungeon broken, their minds fractured by fear. Some recanted confessions immediately, only to be tortured again. Others lived in silence, never daring to speak of what they endured. Yet the Inquisition insisted it was all for mercy. The goal was not death, they said, but repentance. Torture was the surgeon's knife cutting away infection. Burning at the stake was not punishment, but purification. Inquisitors could write with a straight face that they had saved countless souls, even as those souls screamed themselves hoarse in the dungeon. For Spain, the dungeon became legend. Children grew up fearing the knock at night, imagining the racks and boots that awaited disobedience. In taverns, men lowered their voices, speaking only in hints about the horrors below. Foreign travellers wrote in shock of the secrecy and cruelty they glimpsed. Even centuries later, long after the worst fires had burned out, the word Inquisition summoned visions of the dungeon, the instruments of torment gleaming in the torchlight, waiting for the next soul to stumble through the door. What end did it serve? Did it create true belief or only penance? Historians argue. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, the effect was undeniable. Heresy in Spain became invisible. dissent ceased to speak aloud. Whether belief was genuine or not mattered little. The flames had burned it out of sight. The dungeon had wrung it out of mouths. The instruments had made conformity indistinguishable from faith. The dungeon taught Spain to fear itself. If the dungeon was the Inquisition's secret heart, then the auto-da-fe was its public face. The dungeon broke bodies in trance. The square reminded the living why silence was necessary. The words themselves, auto-da-fe, act of faith, cloaked horror in piety. What unfolded in city after city was not merely punishment, but theatre, a sacred drama performed before the eyes of thousands, where every robe, every hymn, every flame carried meaning. The preparations began weeks in advance. When inquisitors announced that an auto-da-fe would be held, anticipation rippled across the town. Word spread in taverns and marketplaces. Prisoners had confessed. Sentences would be read, justice would be shown. Inns filled with travellers, pilgrims and nobles who came to witness. Merchants set up stalls at the edges of the square selling bread, wine, trinkets. Children whispered in excitement, tugging at their mothers' sleeves, begging to see the spectacle. On the appointed morning the city stirred before dawn. Bells tolled in the foe, churches summoning the faithful. Soldiers marched through the streets, driving the crowd toward the plaza, their halberds gleaming in the early light. The square itself had been transformed into a stage. Platforms were erected for inquisitors and nobles, adorned with tapestries and crucifixes. A great canopy shaded the seats reserved for Ferdinand and Isabella, or for their deputies when they could not attend. At the centre of the square stood the scaffold, broad and high, draped in black. Nearby loomed the stakes, thick timbers already encircled by bundles of wood, ready for the fire. At mid-morning the procession began. First came banners of the Inquisition, the cross flanked by the sword and the olive branch, symbolising mercy and justice. Then came the inquisitors themselves, black-robed Dominicans walking with grave faces, crucifixes lifted high. Behind them shuffled the prisoners. Each wore the sambenito, the penitential robe that marked their crime. Painted flames covered the cloth for those condemned to burn. Grotesque devils and demons leered from the fabric, proclaiming the soul's corruption. On their heads sat tall paper caps, carrozas, painted with similar images. Some prisoners walked with chains dragging, others with ropes binding their wrists. Guards flanked them, prodding them forward with pikes. The crowd surged to see, mothers lifted their children onto shoulders, men jostled for vantage points, women clutched rosaries and whispered prayers. For many this was the first glimpse of neighbours long vanished into the Inquisition's prisons. The tailor who once sewed their clothes, the scholar who once taught their children, the widow who once lent them bread. Now those same faces were hollow-eyed, pale, broken, their sins written across their garments. The prisoners were seated on benches before the scaffold, awaiting judgment. One by one their names were called. A notary read the charges, the inquisitors pronounced the verdicts, and the sentences were given. Some were spared death, condemned instead to lifelong penance. They would wear their sambenitos in public for years to come, walking emblems of heresy subdued. Others were sentenced to imprisonment, their property seized, their families ruined, but for the most condemned, those deemed unrepentant, or whose crimes were too grave, the word fell like a blade. Relaxation to the secular arm. It meant death by fire. The condemned who confessed at the last moment might be granted mercy, strangled before the flames touched them. But those who refused, who proclaimed innocence to the end, were chained alive to the stake. The ritual did not end there. Before the execution, a sermon was preached, long and fiery, denouncing heresy, praising orthodoxy, warning the crowd. Priests thundered that Spain must be cleansed, that the unity of Christendom demanded obedience, that God's wrath awaited those who faltered. The condemned knelt or stood, some praying, some silent, some crying out. Then the final act began. The condemned were marched to the stakes, their sambenitos fluttering in the wind. Executioners tied them with ropes and chains, piling straw and wood at their feet. Torches were brought forward, flames hissing as they touched the kindling. Smoke billowed upward, acrid and choking as the fire roared to life. The crowd watched, transfixed. Some shouted prayers, others curses, others wept. Children clung to their mothers, their eyes wide with terror and fascination. The condemned screamed as the flames rose, their cries mingling with the chanting of priests. the air filled with the stench of burning flesh, the roar of fire, the murmurs of thousands. To the Inquisitors, this was not cruelty but triumph. They watched from their platform, faces stern, hands clasped in prayer. The auto da fe was proof of their success, heresy rooted out, souls purified, the people reminded of God's justice. For Ferdinand and Isabella, when present, it was reassurance that their kingdom was united in faith, their subjects obedient, their enemies consumed. But for the people in the square, the meaning was more complex. Some saw justice, believing truly that heretics endangered not only their own souls but the salvation of the community. Others saw the horror, the lesson etched in flame. Do not speak, do not doubt, do not distrust even your family. Many saw both, faith and fear, devotion and dread fused together until they were indistinguishable. The auto da fe became the Inquisition's most enduring symbol. It was repeated across Spain in Seville, Toledo, Valladolid, Barcelona. It spread to the New World, staged in Mexico City and Lima. Each was both ritual and warning, spectacle and sermon. The Inquisition's power did not depend solely on dungeons or torture chambers. It depended on memory. Every child who saw flames rise in the square carried the image for life. Every family who smelled smoke on the wind remembered it when they whispered prayers at night. The auto da fe was the Inquisition's theatre, and the audience was all of Spain. Not all burned, some lived, but even those who escaped the flames bore scars. The lifelong shame of the San Benito, the poverty of confiscated property, the isolation of being shunned by neighbours, all were punishments designed to extend beyond death. In many towns, the walls of churches displayed painted San Benitos with the names of the condemned, reminders that even the grave could not erase heresy. In the end, the auto da fe was not about the condemned at all. It was about the living. It was about showing in fire and smoke that the Inquisition was everywhere, that heresy was futile, that obedience was survival. It was about turning terror into liturgy, making fear part of worship, and it worked. For centuries, Spain remembered the auto da fe as both holy ritual and nightmare. To some, it was proof of God's justice. To others, it was proof of man's cruelty. To all this was unforgettable. The sight of flames in the square, the cries of the dying, the crucifix raised high above it all. The dungeon broke individuals. The auto da fe broke communities, and together they made the Inquisition eternal. In the beginning, it was the Jews who felt the Inquisition's fire most keenly. Not the Jews who openly lived as Jews, their fate would come later in 1492 with expulsion, but those who had bent beneath the sword of baptism, who wore the cross outwardly, while neighbours whispered they clung to the old ways in secret. They were called conversos, new Christians, and in them Spain found its most useful enemy. Their story stretched back more than a century before the Inquisition's birth. In 1391, mobs swept through Seville, Valencia, Barcelona, and Toledo, slaughtering Jews in pogroms so brutal that blood filled gutters and synagogues burned. Those who survived faced a cruel choice, baptism or death. Many chose baptism, not out of conviction, but necessity, taking Christian names, attending Mass, raising their children in outward faith. Yet memory lingered. In kitchens, some still lit candles on Friday evenings. In bedrooms, some whispered Hebrew prayers. In burial, some followed the rites of their ancestors. These fragments of Judaism, passed quietly from parent to child, became seeds of suspicion. By the mid-15th century, conversos were a paradox in Spanish society. Outwardly, they were Christian, often rising to positions of wealth and influence. Some became royal tax collectors, secretaries, even bishops. Their literacy, business acumen and networks gave them power disproportionate to their numbers, but their success bred resentment. Old Christians muttered that conversos were greedy, untrustworthy, false in their faith. Rumours flourished that they spit out the Eucharist, that they bathed to wash away baptism, that they whispered Hebrew over their meals. The word Judaizer became a curse, one that required no proof to stain a family forever. It was this simmering resentment that the Inquisition weaponized. In Seville in 1481, the first mass trials targeted conversos accused of secretly observing the law of Moses. The accusations were often trivial, failing to eat pork, refusing to work on Saturday, wearing clean clothes on the Sabbath. But each small act became evidence of vast conspiracy. A neighbour who noticed a family buying lamb before Passover a servant who saw a mistress washing meat carefully in water, a child who repeated a whispered prayer, all could trigger arrest. The prisons filled with converso families. Men and women who had once traded freely in markets now sat in chains, their wealth confiscated, their reputations shattered. Many confessed under torture, naming relatives and neighbours in desperate bids for mercy. Others went defiantly to the stake, proclaiming innocence even as flames consumed them. In Seville alone, hundreds burned in the early years. Their ashes blew across the city. Like unholy incense, the smell of scorched flesh clinging to hair and cloth, the terror spread outward. In Toledo, Valladolid, Córdoba, Valencia, conversos vanished into the dungeons. The Inquisition became a net thrown across Spain, dragging down entire communities. Families fled, selling homes at ruinous prices to escape suspicion. Some sought refuge in Portugal or Italy, carrying with them memories of smoke and fear. Yet flight was no guarantee. Wherever they went, suspicion followed, for converso blood could never be washed clean. The stain of blood became doctrine. Laws were drafted excluding conversos from certain offices, colleges, guilds. Marriage alliances were scrutinized for traces of tainted ancestry. The idea of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, took root, a poison that would spread through Spain for centuries. It was not enough to be Christian by faith. One had to be Christian by lineage. A single Jewish ancestor, generations removed, could damn a family to suspicion forever. For those who remained, life became performance. Converso households went to Mass conspicuously, crossing themselves elaborately at the right moments. They served pork publicly, sometimes even staging feasts where swine was consumed in excess, this to prove loyalty. They baptized children quickly, named them after saints, invited neighbours to witness. Faith was no longer private. It was theatre of survival. But no performance could erase the fear. At night, families whispered behind shuttered windows. Should they risk lighting Sabbath candles, or would a neighbour see the flicker and denounce them? Should they avoid pork, or force themselves to eat it and choke on bile? Children grew up in this double world, torn between the cross and the star, between the Mass and the whispered Shema. Their very identity became weapon against them. The Inquisition thrived on this ambiguity. Unlike open heresy, converso Judaizing could never be conclusively disproved. One could attend church daily, take communion faithfully, confess sins devoutly, and still be accused. Suspicion was itself evidence. The harder a converso tried to prove sincerity, the more neighbours whispered it was disguise. Innocence was impossible, and so the trials multiplied. Entire family trees were ensnared, branches cut down generation by generation. Wealthy conversos in particular made lucrative prey. Their estates once seized enriched the Inquisition and the crown alike. To be prosperous was to be marked. To be envied was to be doomed. In 1492, Torquemada urged Ferdinand and Isabella to take the final step. If conversos were corrupt because of lingering ties to Judaism, then the Jews themselves must be expelled, cut off from Spain's body like a gangrenous limb. That spring, the monarch signed the Edict of Expulsion. All Jews who refused baptism were ordered to leave within 4 months, abandoning homes, businesses, possessions. Tens of thousands trudged to ports carrying only what they could bear. Many died on the road, others were robbed, cheated, slaughtered. Ships carried them into exile to Portugal, North Africa, Italy, the Ottoman Empire. But expulsion solved nothing. Many Jews, desperate to remain, accepted baptism. These new converts swelled the ranks of conversos, fueling further suspicion. And those who fled carried their traditions with them, building diasporas that remembered Spain not with love, but with grief. Among them, stories of the Inquisition hardened into legend. The screams in dungeons, the fires in plazas, the betrayal of neighbours. In Spain itself, conversos remained the Inquisition's favoured quarry for generations. Every new tribunal, every new inquisitor found them easy prey. They were too visible to ignore, too different to trust, too valuable to abandon. Their fate was to live forever under shadow, their existence a perpetual trial. The tragedy of the conversos was not only in fire and exile, but in identity itself. They were neither fully Jewish nor fully Christian, neither accepted by the old faith nor trusted by the new. They became ghosts in their own land, walking reminders of Spain's lost diversity, permanent targets of suspicion. For the Inquisition, they were perfect, heresy that could never be disproved. communities that could never be fully destroyed, blood that could never be purified. And so, for centuries, conversos lived and died in the shadow of the stake, their names recorded in inquisitorial ledgers, their property scattered, their prayers silenced. The fate of the conversos was the fate of Spain itself, a kingdom that chose unity through fear, purity through fire, and left ashes where once there had been life. The year 1492 is remembered for Columbus and the New World, but in Spain it was remembered first for Granada. On a cold January day, Ferdinand and Isabella rode into the city that had been the last jewel of Muslim rule in Iberia. The red banners of Castile and Aragon unfurled over the Alhambra's towers, and the crescent moon that had glimmered there for centuries was lowered in silence. With that act, 800 years of Islamic Spain ended. The surrender treaty promised tolerance. The Muslims of Granada, artisans, farmers, poets, scholars, were assured they could keep their mosques, their language, their customs. At first, the monarchs kept their word, knowing stability required patience. But tolerance was a fragile mask. Behind it, pressure mounted. Priests and friars flooded Granada, determined to baptize the infidels. Missionaries thundered that Spain could not be truly Catholic while Islam whispered in its streets. And within a decade, the treaty was broken. Baptism was no longer voluntary. Muslims were ordered to convert or face expulsion. Many chose the font, not from conviction, but from survival. They became Morisco, baptized Muslims, new Christians, in name, but Muslims still in heart and memory. Like the conversos before them, they entered a twilight existence, outwardly conformed but inwardly suspect. The Inquisition followed swiftly. By the early 1500s, inquisitors prowled Granada's narrow alleys, its whitewashed houses and jasmine courtyards, searching for signs of heresy. Suspicion took root in every gesture. A Morisco who spoke Arabic instead of Castilian was accused of clinging to the Quran. A woman who washed carefully before prayer was accused of Islamic ritual. Families who avoided pork were denounced as apostates. Even the way one greeted a neighbour, salam alaikum, whispered out of habit, could be evidence of heresy. Denunciations multiplied. Neighbours spied on neighbours, servants betrayed masters, children betrayed parents. Entire districts of Granada fell under suspicion. The prisons filled with Moriscos accused of praying eastward, of fasting during Ramadan, of refusing to drink wine. Confessions were wrung from them with the same instruments of torment used on conversos, the rack, the strappado, the watercloth. The screams in the dungeons of Seville and Toledo were joined by those in Granada. The crown cloaked this persecution in the language of unity. Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella declared must be one flock under one shepherd. Diversity was weakness, division an open wound. To allow Islam to linger was to invite rebellion, invasion, divine wrath. And yet, the repression itself sowed the seeds of revolt. In 1499, under Cardinal Cisneros' harsh policies of forced baptism, Granada erupted in rebellion. Morisco fighters took up arms in the Alpujarras Mountains, striking from ravines and caves against Christian soldiers. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders executed, its survivors driven deeper into submission. But the memory of resistance lingered. For the Inquisition, it was proof that suspicion had been justified. As decades passed, the Moriscos lived double lives much like the conversos. By day they attended Mass, took communion and baptized their children with Christian names. By night in secret they whispered the Shahada, taught their children verses of the Quran, and passed down fragments of tradition in hushed tones. In kitchens they cooked dishes spiced with cumin and saffron, the flavours of Al-Andalus, careful to mask them beneath pork to appease watching neighbours. In farmhouses they sang lullabies in Arabic, though they risked the dungeon for it. Faith became inheritance disguised as memory, hidden in gestures, in recipes, in words that survived only in shadows. The Inquisition sharpened its gaze. To inquisitors, Moriscos were not simply heretics. They were traitors in waiting, a fifth column loyal to the Sultan in Istanbul or the corsairs of North Africa. When Ottoman fleets raided the Mediterranean, Spanish preachers thundered that Moriscos lit lamps in their windows to guide the enemy. When storms struck harvests, priests declared it was God's punishment for the secret prayers of Muslims. Suspicion grew into paranoia into policy. By the mid-16th century, the Moriscos were branded irredeemable. The Inquisition's dungeons overflowed with their bodies. Autodafés burned them in squares from Valencia to Zaragoza. Yet still whispers persisted, that entire villages spoke Arabic, that Morisco women washed before dawn prayers, that children were circumcised in secret. No matter how many confessions were wrung, how many fires burned, the Inquisition could never silence the memory of centuries of Islam in Spain. The tension erupted again in the rebellion of the Alpujarras, 1568 to 1571. Morisco peasants, driven by relentless persecution, rose once more in arms, fortified by the memory of Granada's fall and the hope of Ottoman rescue. For 3 years, the mountains of Andalusia ran red with blood. Christian armies crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency, villages burned, men slaughtered, women and children sold into slavery. Survivors were scattered, resettled across Spain to sever their ties to homeland and heritage. But scattering did not erase suspicion, it only spread it further. In the centuries that followed, the Inquisition continued to prosecute Moriscos relentlessly. Accusations of apostasy, of secret Qurans hidden in walls, of clandestine prayers never ceased. Records tell of trials where entire families stood accused, fathers for refusing pork, mothers for teaching Arabic tongues, children for speaking unfamiliar words. Torture and execution followed. The same grim pattern repeated endlessly. Finally, in 1609, King Philip III signed the Edict of Expulsion. Between 300,000 and 400,000 Moriscos were forced to leave Spain, marched to ports under armed guard, herded onto ships bound for North Africa. Many perished in transit, robbed by captains, abandoned on hostile shores. Entire villages in Valencia and Aragon stood empty, fields untended, houses collapsing into ruin. Spain declared itself cleansed. But the price was immense. Farms lay abandoned, industries collapsed, and centuries of cultural memory vanished in a single decree. The Inquisition had prepared the ground for this expulsion. For more than a century it had branded Moriscos untrustworthy, irredeemable, dangerous. The flames that consumed their bodies foreshadowed the ships that carried away their descendants. The tragedy of the Moriscos was not only their exile, but the erasure of memory. The architecture of Granada still whispered of Islamic genius. The Alhambra still shimmered with arabesques. But the people who had built such beauty were gone. In Spain's official story, they became shadows, remembered only as heretics, rebels, traitors. Their songs faded, their language silenced, their graves unmarked. And yet, in the kitchens of Spain, in the cadence of its music, in the irrigation of its fields, traces of the Moriscos remained. They could not be fully erased, for their centuries in Iberia had sunk roots too deep. But in the Spain of Ferdinand, Isabella, and their successors, those roots were poisoned, their legacy stained with the smoke of the Inquisition's fires. For the Inquisition, the Moriscos were proof of its necessity. Here was an entire people accused not of what they did, but of what they were. To be Morisco was to be guilty. Their fate showed that the Inquisition was not merely a tribunal of heresy, but a weapon of identity, deciding who belonged in Spain and who would burn or be driven into the sea. The Spanish Inquisition did not stop with conversos or Moriscos. Its shadow crept further, stretching into every corner of belief, until no one in Spain could feel certain of safety. If the body of Spain was to be one, then all deviation, all difference had to be cut away. Jews and Muslims were obvious targets, outsiders who could be marked by ancestry and blood. But heresy also lurked within Christianity itself, in whispers of reform, in visions and prophecies, in women who claimed strange powers. To the Inquisition, these too became threats. By the mid-16th century, Protestantism had spread like wildfire across Europe. Martin Luther's defiance in Wittenberg had torn open the unity of Christendom. From Germany to England to Geneva, reformers denounced the Pope, questioned the sacraments, called for a return to Scripture. Spain, deeply tied to Catholic orthodoxy, was not immune. Sailors carried books across borders, students returned from Paris or Louvain with dangerous questions. Merchants brought Lutheran pamphlets hidden among bolts of cloth. Even within Spain, some priests and scholars whispered of reform, inspired by Erasmus and other humanists. The Inquisition responded with ferocity. In the 1550s, under King Philip II, Spain launched a crackdown against suspected Protestants. Entire convents were raided, accused of harbouring reformist books. In Valladolid and Seville, dozens of men and women, nobles, priests, even nuns, were arrested, charged with Lutheran heresy. Their trials were swift, their sentences spectacular. Autodafé saw Protestants burned alive, their ashes scattered to the winds as priests proclaimed Spain cleansed of contagion. For Philip, this was more than theology. Protestantism was rebellion, an infection that might spread to weaken Spain as it had divided Germany and France. The Inquisition was his weapon to keep Spain unbroken. And so the dungeons filled with those who merely questioned, who read the wrong book, who prayed in the wrong words. But not all heresy wore the face of Protestant reform. Some heresy came from within Catholic devotion itself. Mystics troubled the Inquisition. Spain in the 16th century was a land of intense piety, where visions, ecstasies, and prophecies flourished. Women in particular claimed visions of Christ, of angels, of the Virgin Mary. They spoke in tongues, swooned in rapture, wrote diaries of divine encounters. For some, like Teresa of Avila, mysticism brought sainthood, but for others, it brought suspicion. The Inquisition feared the Alumbrados, the Illuminated, a movement that emphasized direct union with God through inner light, often dismissing priests and sacraments as unnecessary. Such claims undermined the Church's authority. In Toledo and Seville, Alumbrados were investigated, imprisoned, and condemned. Some were forced to abjure, others disappeared into cells. Mysticism was permitted only when it bowed before orthodoxy. When it strayed, the flames awaited. And then there were the witches. Unlike northern Europe, where witch hunts consumed thousands, Spain's witch trials were fewer. But they were no less terrifying for those caught in their net. The Basque country in particular saw waves of accusation. In 1609, following rumours of a coven in the village of Zugarramurdi, inquisitors descended upon the Pyrenees. Children spoke of midnight Sabbaths, of witches flying through the night, of feasts with the devil. Fear spread like contagion. Hundreds were accused, dragged before inquisitors. The Inquisition's approach to witchcraft was complex. Unlike secular courts in Germany or Scotland, which burned thousands on flimsy testimony, the Inquisition often demanded stronger proof, yet proof was always relative. Confessions under torture spoke of flying ointments, pacts with Satan, cannibal feasts. Neighbours testified to curses, to withered crops, to sudden deaths. In 1610, at an auto da fe in Logroño, 11 accused witches were executed, while dozens more were paraded in shame. For Spain, witchcraft blended fear of the devil with fear of difference. Wise women who practiced healing with herbs, midwives who knew the secrets of childbirth, widows who lived alone at village edges, all could be branded witches. In a patriarchal society where obedience was prized, women who acted outside control became dangerous. The Inquisition turned them into symbols of corruption, even when evidence was thin. Heretics and witches alike became tools of propaganda. Each trial proved to the faithful that Spain was pure, that God's wrath was held at bay by vigilance. Each execution was theatre, each confession proof that the devil was everywhere. The very vagueness of heresy was its power. Where Jews and Muslims could be identified by blood, heresy could lurk in any soul. No one was immune. Yet the Inquisition also knew restraint. In some cases, it dismissed wild witchcraft accusations, fearing they would spiral into mass hysteria, but even restraint worked as terror. To know that the Inquisition could investigate witches, even if it sometimes spared them, kept the possibility alive. Fear of the dungeon was as strong as the dungeon itself. In the end, the Inquisition's pursuit of heretics and witches revealed its true nature. It was never about one group alone. Jews, Muslims, Protestants, mystics, witches, all were convenient faces for the same lesson: obedience. The Inquisition was less about God than about control, less about truth than about sealiness. By stretching its gaze to all corners of belief, it ensured that Spain remained a theatre where every act of faith, every private thought, every whispered word was shadowed by the fear of fire. For Protestants, the Inquisition was a wall keeping Spain Catholic even as Europe fractured. For mystics, it was a leash, reining in visions that strayed too far. For witches, it was the shadow at the village edge, waiting for accusation to turn into chains. And for Spain as a whole, it was a reminder that the Inquisition's fire could burn anyone, at any time. The Inquisition ruled not only with chains and fire, but with silence and rumour. Its greatest weapon was not the rack nor the stake, but fear itself, the fear that it might be watching, that at any moment a careless word, a careless gesture might summon the inquisitors to your door. Spain lived beneath this invisible shadow for centuries, its people policing themselves long before a tribunal ever needed to intervene. Fear began in the marketplace, where whispers spread faster than bread could be sold. A man crossed himself too slowly at mass, and neighbours murmured. A woman refused wine at a feast, and suspicion stirred. A family closed their shutters early on Friday nights, and eyes narrowed. These whispers did not fade with the day, they grew in silence, passed from lips to ears until someone, whether out of devotion or malice, carried them to the nearest priest or notary. The Inquisition thrived on such rumours. Its very structure depended on informants. Anyone could denounce anyone, and the accused would never know the accuser's name. A servant could betray a master, a wife her husband, a child his parents. Even the faintest suspicion became a weapon. In many towns this turned neighbour against neighbour, until trust itself seemed treasonous. The secrecy of trials amplified the terror. Prisoners vanished into dungeons, their fates unknown for months. Families waited in dread, forbidden to ask questions, forbidden even to pray too openly for fear of seeming to side with the heretic. When verdicts finally emerged at an auto da fe, they were often shocking. Men once respected now paraded in sanbenitos, women once devout now condemned as witches. The mystery of what happened inside inquisitorial walls made the institution seem omnipotent. If it could find sin in the pious, what hope had the rest? Propaganda sealed the fear. The Inquisition knew the power of symbols. The San Benito itself was a walking proclamation of guilt, a garment painted with flames and demons, designed to humiliate and terrify. Even after the condemned were dead, their sanbenitos were sometimes hung in churches painted with their names, a permanent warning to the living. To walk past such a display was to feel the Inquisition's gaze, long after the accused had turned to ash. Images of the Inquisition spread far beyond Spain. Pamphlets, engravings, and plays circulated across Europe, feeding what would later be called the Black Legend. Some exaggerated the cruelty, describing instruments of torment that never existed, iron maidens, furnaces, cages of spikes. Others depicted the reality, the rack, the stake, the processions of the auto da fe. For Spain's enemies, these images were propaganda against an empire seen as fanatical and tyrannical. For Spaniards themselves, they were mirrors, distorted perhaps, but still reflecting the terror they lived under. The Inquisition itself cultivated fear deliberately. It announced its presence with solemnity. Inquisitors arriving in a city under banners of the cross and swords, sermons preached in packed cathedrals, threats proclaimed from pulpits. The message was clear. Heresy was not a private sin but a danger to all, and vigilance was the duty of every Christian. Inquisitors reminded congregations that to remain silent about a neighbour's errors was itself a sin, punishable as complicity. Thus fear became contagious, compelling denunciation as a form of self-defence. The psychological toll was immense. Spaniards learned to perform their faith constantly, to eat pork in public even when sickened by it, to cross themselves with exaggerated devotion, to murmur prayers loudly enough for others to hear. Faith became theatre, a mask worn to ward off suspicion. Children were raised to watch their tongues, to conceal questions, to suspect even friends. This climate of fear seeped into art and literature. Playwrights hinted at heretics destroyed, poets alluded to flames, chroniclers wrote cautiously lest they be accused themselves. Silence became as eloquent as speech. The absence of dissent in Spanish letters was not proof of unity, but proof of terror. Generations grew up unable to imagine alternatives, their imaginations bounded by fire. Abroad, Spain's enemies weaponized the Inquisition as symbol. Protestant England and the Netherlands painted Spain as the bloody nation, its ships carrying not only soldiers but inquisitors, its empire built not on faith but on cruelty. The Dutch rebel William of Orange condemned Spain as enslaved by monks and pyres. In England, tales of Spanish cruelty in the New World blended with tales of the Inquisition to create an enduring image. Spain as the land of fire and fanaticism. Yet within Spain the terror was subtler. It was not always the flames, but the possibility of flames that haunted. Most Spaniards never saw an auto da fe, never entered a dungeon, never faced an inquisitor. But they behaved as if they might. The Inquisition's genius lay in its ability to extend fear beyond its actual reach, to make people discipline themselves, to make violence a habit and obedience instinct. And so propaganda and fear worked together. The Inquisition did not merely punish, it haunted. It was a presence in every square, every church, every whispered prayer. It turned Spain into a nation where thought itself could be crime, where difference became invisible, where unity was built on students. Even centuries later, when the Inquisition's power waned, its shadow lingered. Spaniards remembered the silence, the whispers, the fear of denunciation. The legacy of suspicion outlived the dungeons and the flames. For this was the true genius of the Inquisition, not the fire that burned bodies, but the fear that burned minds. The Spanish Inquisition was never only about faith, that is the story told in sermons, in bulls sealed with wax, in the words of inquisitors who spoke of saving souls from damnation. But beneath the crucifixes and prayers, another truth burned. The Inquisition was also about crowns and coffers, about power gathered in shadows and flames. Religion was its cloak, politics was its beating heart. From the moment of its creation in 1478, the Inquisition differed from earlier medieval tribunals. In France or Italy, inquisitors were servants of the papacy, dispatched to hunt heresy on behalf of Rome. Their authority flowed downward from the Pope, and kings tolerated them uneasily. But in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella secured something unprecedented. The Inquisition was theirs. They appointed the inquisitors, oversaw the tribunals, reaped the profits. The Pope had granted permission, but the crown wielded the blade. This subtle shift gave the monarchs extraordinary power. Inquisitors answered not to Rome, but to Madrid. Heresy became treason, dissent against religion became dissent against king and queen. To oppose the Inquisition was to oppose the monarchy itself. What better instrument could rulers desire? The political uses of the Inquisition became evident quickly. Its trials targeted not only Jews and Muslims, but nobles whose loyalty wavered, towns too independent, voices too bold. A whisper of heresy could bring down a rival, confiscate his estate, silence his defiance. The Inquisition was a net the crown could cast wherever it pleased, catching enemies under the guise of faith. Wealth flowed upward through its machinery. When a converso was condemned, his property was seized. Houses, lands, jewels, even clothing were catalogued and divided between the Inquisition and the crown. Trials enriched not only inquisitors, but the monarchy that oversaw them. For Ferdinand, ever pragmatic, this was as important as saving souls. Each pyre meant more gold in coffers, more farms to redistribute to loyal subjects. The Inquisition also served as instrument of surveillance. In towns across Spain, it wove a web of informants, priests in confessionals, neighbours in marketplaces, servants in kitchens. Reports flowed upward, filling archives with whispers. The crown had never before possessed such a network. Through the Inquisition, it learned who murmured against taxes, who muttered about rebellion, who dreamed of a different faith. Fear kept subjects obedient, but it also kept them legible to power. This intertwining of faith and politics reached its height under Philip II. The stern monarch, who ruled Spain at its zenith in the 16th century, was inseparable from the Inquisition. He saw himself as God's chosen defender, the hammer of heretics, the guardian of Catholic Europe. Yet he also knew the Inquisition kept his empire intact. In Spain it crushed Protestant dissent. In the Netherlands its severity helped spark rebellion, but even there, Philip preferred flames to compromise. For him, faith and power were inseparable. The political theatre of the auto da fe revealed this fusion. When kings and queens attended, seated under canopies of gold and crimson, the ritual became more than religion. It was monarchy made visible, sovereign authority fused with divine will. The condemned knelt not only before God but before king. The fire consumed not only heretics but enemies of the crown. To watch was to learn that obedience to God and obedience to monarch were the same. Nobles too were not immune. The Inquisition was often turned against them when their loyalty wavered. A duke who withheld taxes, a lord suspected of conspiracy, heresy could always be found or invented. To be accused by the Inquisition was to face ruin, regardless of lineage. Estates were seized, titles stripped, reputations annihilated. In this way, the crown tamed its nobility, binding them in fear. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond Spain itself. In the New World, inquisitors established tribunals in Mexico, Lima, Cartagena. There too the machinery served empire as much as faith. Indigenous converts who clung to old gods, African slaves who whispered ancestral prayers, all fell under suspicion. But just as in Spain, accusations of heresy were often intertwined with disputes over land, power, and rebellion. The Inquisition justified conquest as easily as it justified faith. This political dimension was not hidden. Spaniards knew the crown profited from the condemned. They knew inquisitors enjoyed privileges and exemptions, living comfortably on confiscated wealth. Grumbling spread, though rarely allowed. Some clerics, even some popes, protested the abuses, yet the system endured for centuries, too useful to monarchs, too profitable to inquisitors. The irony was stark. An institution proclaimed as a shield of faith became a tool of control. It policed not only belief but loyalty. It punished not only sin but dissent. It enriched those who wielded it even as it impoverished those it condemned. And yet, because it spoke always in the language of God, its political motives were obscured. Who could question the defense of faith? Who could doubt the need to protect souls? To oppose the Inquisition was to risk being branded a heretic oneself. Thus politics cloaked itself in piety, and piety served politics. The people understood this, even if they could not say it aloud. In taverns they muttered that the Inquisition targeted the wealthy more than the poor, that confessions conveniently produced estates for the crown. They whispered that inquisitors served the king first, God second, but whispers never became shouts. Fear kept tongues still. The system thrived because it was unchallengeable, a union of altar and throne sealed by fire. The political consequences shaped Spain for centuries. By silencing dissent, the Inquisition also stifled thought. Scholars hesitated to question doctrine, writers avoided controversy, artists painted within strict bounds. Spain became fortress of orthodoxy, strong but suffocating. Innovation withered, rebellion soldered, silence reigned. While other nations debated, argued, and reformed, Spain bound itself in chains of conformity. Its empire expanded across oceans, yet its spirit narrowed. The Inquisition was not the sole cause of Spain's decline, but it was emblematic of its paradox. Mighty abroad, fearful at home, the very instrument that had unified Spain also kept it rigid, unable to bend without breaking. By the time Enlightenment thinkers denounced it in the 18th century, the Inquisition had long been more political tool than spiritual tribunal. Its dungeons still held prisoners, its autodafés still lit skies, but its real work was already done. It had taught Spain obedience. It had taught its people silence. It had shown monarchs that fear could bind a nation more tightly than love. In the end, the Inquisition's power lay not in faith alone, but in the marriage of faith and politics. Religion gave it legitimacy, politics gave it purpose. Together they created an institution that burned longer than any single dynasty, that survived papal protests, that endured rebellions and reforms. It was the crown's sharpest weapon, cloaked always in God's name. For more than 3 centuries, the Inquisition seemed eternal. It survived monarchs and dynasties, papal rebukes and revolts, wars of conquest and civil wars. Its dungeons swallowed tens of thousands, its autos da fe terrified millions, its name alone silenced dissent. Yet no empire of fear lasts forever. By the 17th century, cracks began to show. By the 18th, the foundation quivered. And by the 19th, the Inquisition, once the most dreaded institution in Christendom, collapsed in the dust of history. Its decline did not come all at once. Like an old building, it crumbled slowly, stone by stone, until at last the entire edifice gave way. The first signs appeared in the 17th century. Spain's empire, once vast and glittering, groaned beneath the weight of endless wars. Silver from the New World dwindled, drained by corruption and conflict. Famine and plague swept across the land. The Inquisition still burned and imprisoned, but its flames seemed dimmer, its fear less absolute. Spaniards endured so many miseries, hunger, war, taxation, that the dungeon was only one terror among many, yet it still struck when needed. In 1610, at Logroño, the Inquisition staged one of its largest witch trials. Hundreds were accused, dozens executed, the rest shamed in public penance. But even here, cracks showed. Some inquisitors doubted the confessions extracted from terrified children, questioned the hysteria of entire villages. The institution that once devoured without hesitation began slowly to hesitate. The Enlightenment quickened the decline. Across Europe in the 18th century, philosophers wielded pen against pyre. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot all condemned the Inquisition as the epitome of fanaticism and tyranny. Pamphlets and books circulated across borders, smuggled into Spain despite censorship, feeding whispers of doubt. To intellectuals, the Inquisition became an embarrassment, a relic of medieval superstition in an age that praised reason. Even within Spain, voices rose. Scholars influenced by Enlightenment thought urged reform. They argued that superstition and fear weakened the nation, that censorship stifled science, that persecution drained talent. Spain, once a centre of learning, had fallen behind. Other nations built universities, published discoveries, explored freely, while Spain silenced itself with the Inquisition's chains. Reformers knew this, and they began to say it aloud. The Bourbons, who inherited Spain's throne in the early 1700s, also eyed the Inquisition with suspicion. Unlike the medieval-minded Habsburgs, the Bourbons, French in origin, brought with them a taste for centralized, rational administration. To them, the Inquisition seemed outdated, even counterproductive. Yet they hesitated to abolish it outright, fearing backlash from clergy and the devout. Instead, they trimmed its claws. Trials slowed, executions grew rarer, censorship remained but softened. Still, the Inquisition clung on. It continued to try heretics, though now they were often more political than religious. Freethinkers, writers, men accused of owning banned books. The dungeon filled less with conversos or moriscos, already expelled or assimilated, and more with intellectuals suspected of Enlightenment ideas. The charge of heresy became a cloak for silencing political dissent. But even here its grip weakened. Public burnings grew fewer. The autos da fe that once drew thousands became rare, almost archaic spectacles. By the early 1800s, Spain convulsed with revolution. Napoleon's armies invaded, the Bourbon monarchy tottered, liberals demanded reform. In 1808, under Joseph Bonaparte, the Inquisition was officially abolished, briefly. When Ferdinand VII returned to the throne in 1814, he restored it, desperate for tools of control. But the old fear was gone. Spain had changed. Revolutionary ideas had seeped too deeply, and Europe itself had turned against such institutions. In 1820, liberal revolts forced its suppression again. In 1834, under the regency of Maria Cristina, it was abolished once and for all. 3.5 centuries after its birth, the Holy Office of the Spanish Inquisition ceased to exist. But even in death, its youth lingered. The decline of the Inquisition left behind ruins, not only in stone but in memory. Its dungeons stood empty, but their silence was heavy. In Seville, Toledo, Valencia, visitors shuddered at the cells where prisoners had once whispered their last prayers. In churches, San Benito still hung, faded and tattered, reminders of families condemned. In archives, records of confessions and trials sat in dust, their ink preserving centuries of fear. Its cultural legacy was equally profound. Spain had lost centuries of intellectual freedom. Writers thinkers exiled, books censored, while the price of obedience was stagnation. While France debated philosophy and England explored science, Spain clung to orthodoxy, fearful of stepping beyond the boundaries the Inquisition had drawn. By the 19th century, Spain was no longer the mighty empire it once was, but a weakened nation haunted by its past. And abroad, the legend of the Inquisition endured. Protestants and liberals across Europe used it as symbol of Catholic cruelty, of Spanish tyranny. Engravings of torture chambers, pamphlets of burning heretics, stories of endless racks and iron maidens circulated widely. Some of these tales exaggerated the truth, feeding the black legend of Spain. But the exaggerations worked because they rested on real horror. Torture, secrecy, fire, these needed no invention. The final decline of the Inquisition was less dramatic than its birth. There were no great fires to mark its end, no grand trials to close its history. Instead, it withered, drained of purpose, eroded by the new ideas, dismantled by politics. But the silence it left behind was not relief. For many, it was emptiness, the sense that something immense had passed but not vanished, like smoke dissipating but leaving its stench behind. Spain was free of the Inquisition, but not of its memory. Generations had been raised in fear, taught to obey without question, taught to mistrust their own thoughts. The shadow of suspicion lingered long after the last inquisitor laid down his quill. The Inquisition's decline is often told as triumph of reason over fanaticism, of progress over darkness. And in part it was, but it was also tragedy, for what had been destroyed could not be restored. The voices silenced by fear never returned. The communities scattered and Jews expelled, Moriscos exiled, were lost forever. The books burned, the ideas censored, the minds crushed in dungeons. All were gone, leaving only scars. By 1834, when the final decree of abolition was signed, the Inquisition had outlived its creators by centuries. Ferdinand and Isabella were dust, Torquemada a legend, Philip II a memory. Yet the institution they had built endured longer than most empires. Its death came not from within, but from without, from a changing world that no longer tolerated such engines of fear. But to those who lived under it, the end mattered little. For them, the Inquisition was not simply history, but memory, the knock at night, the whispered denunciation, the smell of smoke in the square. Its decline did not erase what had been suffered. It merely closed the book, leaving the ink to dry into legend. When the Spanish Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834, it did not die. Its dungeons were emptied, its records sealed in dusty archives, its officials dismissed into obscurity, but the Inquisition itself lived on in imagination. Across Europe and the world, its image loomed larger than its reality. It became symbol, nightmare, weapon. To separate fact from myth is difficult, for the two were bound together in fire and ink, in memory and propaganda. The reality was grim enough. Thousands were executed over 3 centuries, tens of thousands more imprisoned, tortured, humiliated. Families were destroyed, communities scattered, reputations blackened beyond repair. The secrecy of its trials, the cruelty of its dungeons, the spectacle of its autos da fe, these are beyond dispute, documented in meticulous records kept by the Inquisition itself. The smell of smoke, the cries of prisoners, the fear of denunciation. These were real, lived by generations. Yet the Inquisition also became something more, something monstrous in legend. Enemies of Spain, eager to paint its empire as cruel and fanatical, exaggerated its horrors. Pamphlets printed in the Protestant Netherlands described torture chambers filled with devices unknown to Spain. Woodcuts circulated in London and Geneva showed iron maidens, spiked wheels, furnaces roasting heretics alive. Some of these instruments never existed in inquisitorial dungeons. Others were borrowed from secular courts elsewhere in Europe and attributed wholesale to Spain. This propaganda, known as the Black Legend, spread widely. To Protestant Europe, the Inquisition was proof of Catholic tyranny, of Rome's corruption, of Spain's cruelty. To revolutionaries in later centuries, it symbolized the oppression of monarchy and priest alike. Even today, the phrase Spanish Inquisition conjures images of sadistic monks gleefully torturing innocents in shadowy chambers, an image shaped as much by legend as by truth. But truth was terrible enough. The instruments of torture were real. The rack, the strappado, the watercloth, confessions were extracted under duress, families ruined by confiscations, reputations destroyed by rumour. What the Black Legend added was scale and invention, rivers of blood flowing daily, iron maidens snapping shut on hundreds, pyres burning ceaselessly in every town square. In reality, executions numbered in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands claimed by propagandists. But for those who died screaming in the flames, numbers mattered little. The myth outgrew the reality because secrecy bred imagination. Trials were hidden, accusers anonymous, dungeons closed. No one outside the Inquisition knew the full truth. Into that silence rumour rushed. Each town, embroidered tales of what happened behind the walls. Each pamphlet abroad exaggerated further, until the Inquisition became less an institution than a spectre, an embodiment of terror. And yet, within Spain, the image was different. To many Spaniards, the Inquisition was not only fear but familiarity. Its rituals were woven into life, sermons warning against heresy, processions of penitents in San Benito's, whispers of trials. It was terrifying, but it was also ordinary, part of the fabric of existence. Children grew up with it as one grows up with storms or seasons, dreaded, yes, but expected. This ordinariness made it more insidious. Abroad, the Inquisition was imagined as endless fire and torment. At home, it was the quiet fear that one's neighbour might denounce you, the silence at a tavern. When conversation grew too bold, the careful gestures at Mass to prove devotion, the myth was monstrous. The reality was suffocating. Still, the myth served their purpose. Spain's enemies used them to justify wars, rebellions, and propaganda campaigns. Dutch rebels invoked the Inquisition to rally against Philip II. English pamphleteers spread tales of burning heretics to inflame anti-Catholic sentiment. French philosophers wielded the image to condemn monarchy and church alike. The Inquisition became less Spanish than universal, a shorthand for all tyranny cloaked in piety. Even within Spain, legend bled into memory. Generations later, Spaniards spoke of dungeons more horrific than they had been, of flames larger, of tortures stranger. Memory magnified suffering. Families who had once whispered of ancestors condemned added details over time, until reality and imagination fused. For victims, exaggeration was not lie but truth intensified, a way to convey pain too great for plain fact. The Church itself wrestled with the legacy. Some clerics defended the Inquisition, insisting it had been merciful compared to secular courts, that it had saved souls, that it had executed fewer witches than Northern Europe. There is truth in this. The Spanish Inquisition burned fewer witches than Germany or Scotland, where hysteria claimed tens of thousands. But such comparisons were cold comfort. Mercy measured in fewer corpses is still cruelty. In the modern age, the Inquisition's myth overshadowed its history. Playwrights and novelists seized upon it, dramatising dungeons and pyres, villains in black robes. Painters depicted autos da fe with flames licking the heavens. Historians debated numbers, but popular imagination cared little. The Inquisition was already symbol, more powerful as nightmare than as fact. Even satire joined in. Centuries after its abolition, the phrase, "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition," turned terror into comedy, mocking the very idea of an institution so secret, so sudden, so absurd in its cruelty. Humour was perhaps the only way to tame the nightmare, to strip it of its power. Yet the fact that it could be mocked so easily only proved how deeply its myth had sunk into culture. Separating fact from legend is a historian's task, but in truth, both are inseparable. The Inquisition was real. It imprisoned, tortured, burned. The Inquisition was legend. It became symbol of fanaticism, wielded by enemies and memory alike. To understand it fully is to accept both, the historical reality and the mythic shadow it cast across centuries. In the end, the myths endure because they speak to a deeper truth. Whether or not iron maidens clanged shut in its dungeons, whether or not rivers of blood flowed daily, the Inquisition felt that way to those who lived beneath it. The exaggerations capture the atmosphere of terror, the sense that no one was safe, that fear itself was eternal. Myths exaggerate details, but they do not exaggerate dread. And so the Inquisition remains alive in memory, half fact, half fable. Its flames burned bodies, its myths burned into imagination. And both scars remain. The last pyre has long since burned out. The dungeons have been emptied, the inquisitors dismissed, the tribunals dissolved. The Spanish Inquisition, once feared as eternal, is now a ghost, its body buried in 1834 with the decree of abolition. Yet its shadow lingers. Like smoke that clings to cloth long after the fire has died, its presence endures in memory, in myth, in the way Spain itself is remembered. To stand today in the plazas where autos da fe once blazed is to stand in silence haunted by echoes. Tourists walk across cobblestones where thousands once gathered to watch flames devour the condemned. Cafes line streets where penitents once shuffled in sanbenitos, their painted garments proclaiming guilt. The cathedrals that once thundered with sermons against heresy now ring with choirs, yet their walls remember prayers offered as the condemned march to death. The places remain, but their meanings are layered with ash. What was the Inquisition truly? Was it, as its defenders claimed, a necessary defence of faith in an age of confusion and rebellion? Or was it, as its enemies cried, an engine of cruelty, a mask for greed and power? Perhaps it was both, for history resists simple judgments. The Inquisition was born in an age of fear of division, fear of rebellion, fear of God's wrath. It grew in a soil where identity was fragile, where kingdoms sought unity through uniformity, where the monarchs themselves believed survival depended on obedience. To them, fire was a tool of protection, however brutal. Yet for those who lived beneath it, the Inquisition was terror sanctified. It was the midnight knock at the door, the whispered denunciation, the dungeon where screams mingled with prayers. It was the smell of flesh in the square, the silence in taverns, the forced performance of faith. It was parents teaching children not only the catechism but the art of concealment, of never speaking too freely, of never trusting too deeply. For them, the Inquisition was not theology, but survival. And then there are the myths, the Inquisition of legend, darker and larger than its historical self. Iron maidens snapping shut, heretics roasted daily, endless rivers of blood. Much of this never happened, or happened elsewhere, yet the myths endure because they capture an emotional truth. They show the Inquisition as it felt, immense, unyielding, monstrous. When fact fades, fear fills the void. The true legacy lies between the two. The Inquisition was not the endless slaughter of the Black Legend, nor was it the merciful guardian its apologists claimed. It was something more insidious, an institution that blurred faith and politics, salvation and terror, until obedience itself became holy. Its genius was not in fire but in fear, fear that seeped into every home, every prayer, every silence. Its ashes remain in Spain's history. The expulsion of Jews in 1492 and of Moriscos in 1609 left wounds that never healed. Centuries of suspicion stifled thought, silenced debate, narrowed imagination. Spain's empire stretched across oceans, but within its own borders it became rigid, bound in chains of orthodoxy. The cost was immense. Communities destroyed, knowledge lost, potential strangled. And yet, even in its cruelty, the Inquisition became mirror of humanity itself. It shows how fear can be sanctified, how cruelty can be justified, how faith can be wielded as weapon. It reminds us that institutions of terror do not always wear the face of tyranny alone. Sometimes they wear the face of priests, of kings, of neighbours who believe they are doing good. That is what makes the Inquisition so haunting. It was not an aberration, but an exaggeration of tendencies that exist everywhere: fear of the other, fear of difference, fear of losing power. Today the phrase Spanish Inquisition survives not in law but in culture, in satire, in memory. It is shorthand for sudden interrogation, for cruelty cloaked in absurdity. But behind the jokes the history remains. The screams were real, the ashes were real, the silence was real. The fact that we can laugh now is proof that the terror has passed, but the very fact that the phrase survives is proof that it has not been forgotten. In the end, the Inquisition leaves us with a paradox. It sought to save souls, and in doing so it destroyed lives. It claimed to defend faith, and in doing so it bred fear. It burned bodies, but it also burned imagination. It silenced heretics, but it also silenced truth. It is both history and warning. Stand in the empty square. The stake is gone, the crowd dispersed, the Inquisitor's dust. Only the wind moves now, scattering ash that has long since cooled. Yet if you listen, if you close your eyes, you can still hear the echo of fire, the murmur of prayers, the cries of the condemned. The Inquisition is over, but its shadow remains, a reminder of how thin the line is between devotion and destruction, between salvation and damnation, between faith and fire. And so the curtain falls, the ashes drift into the night. The stage is empty, the stake abandoned, the crucifix still gleaming faintly in memory. The Spanish Inquisition is gone, but the world it created, a world of fear sanctified, of obedience demanded, of service enforced, is not. Its legacy lives wherever power cloaks itself in holiness, wherever fear is called virtue, wherever fire is lit in the name of salvation. The last ember fades, but the story remains.